In the middle of the night, on June 9th, 1912, a family of 6 and their 2 visitors were murdered in Villisca, Iowa. They were bludgeoned to death by someone with an axe. And to this day, their murders remain unsolved.
Monday morning, the 10th of June, 1912, the local town marshal came and went to the house, and he found 2 girls in the northwest bedroom over here, their heads chopped off with an axe, and found husband and wife, Joe and Sarah Moore, and then in the south bedroom, the 4 children. All of them were apparently asleep when they were struck. The killer had picked up an axe in the backyard. All the victims were hit in the head from the chin up.
A lot of people think he got in the house when they were at church and that he hid in the pantry or the attic. But one thing was sure, he was there, waiting for them to fall asleep. Villisca lost its innocence that night in 1912. You're never safe in your own bed, in your own house, in your own town.
Villisca was a small town in southwestern Iowa with a population of between 2,000 and 2,500. In this town lived the Moore family, Father Josiah Moore, the mother Sarah, and their 4 children. 11-year-old Herman Montgomery, 10-year-old Mary Catherine, 7-year-old Arthur, and the youngest child, Paul, age 5. On June 9th, prior to the night of the murder, Sarah Moore had coordinated an annual event at the family's Presbyterian church called the Children's Day Program, which started around 8 p.m. The entire family attended the event when the church services ended at approximately 9:30 p.m. Catherine Moore invited her 2 friends, Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, to spend the night at their house because the sisters were afraid to walk home in the dark. Moore called the residents to ask the parents' permission and got a hold of their older sister Blanche, who said their parents were out but that she would give them the message. At around 9:30, they left the church by foot and arrived at their house between 9:45 and 10 p.m. the next morning. Their neighbor, Mary Peckham, was in her yard hanging laundry around 5 a.m. when she noticed that nobody was awake at the Moore's house yet, which was unusual. At about 7 a.m., she became concerned when nobody had come out of the house to do the regular chore. She approached the Moore's residence and knocked on the door. When no one responded, she attempted to open the door, but it was locked. She went ahead and let the Moore's chickens out of their coop, then called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. When Ross arrived, he tried knocking and shouting through the door, but got no response. He also couldn't see into the house because the window shades had been pulled down. He eventually used a spare key to gain entry into the home. Inside, he discovered 2 bloody bodies covered by a sheet in the bed of the guest bedroom, and blood splattered on the headboard of the bed. He ran outside and immediately phoned Joe's hardware store and asked an employee to alert the town's marshal, Henry Hank Horton, that something terrible had happened. Hank arrived at the house around 8:30 a.m. and began his inspection. There was an uneaten plate of food on the kitchen table next to a pot of bloody water. All the mirrors in the house, and even the glass in the doors, had been covered with clothing that the killer had found while rummaging through the Moore's dressers. The axe used for the murders was partially wiped clean and lying against the wall in the guest bedroom, with a 4 lb slab of bacon wrapped in cloth sitting next to it. The 2 bedrooms that the Moore family occupied had axe marks on the ceiling. Investigators knew these marks were from the attack because there were dust particles from the ceiling on the beds. They also concluded that the marks on the ceilings were not in correlation to hitting the victims. This led some to speculate the killer was swinging the axe around in a crazed frenzy. Sarah Moore was the only one who had obvious slices in her unrecognizable face from the sharp end of the weapon. The rest of the victims had been beaten to death with the blunt end of the axe. The parents had their heads struck at least 20 to 30 times, and there was evidence that the killer had gone to their room twice. After the murderer delivered the fatal blows to everyone's heads, they went to the parents' rooms to do more damage. Josiah Moore was crushed completely from his upper jaw and up. There was blood, brain tissue, and skull fragments spread all over the top of the bed's headboard. In the guest room, Lena Stillinger was hanging 1/3 of the way out of the bed, her nightgown pulled up above her waist and her underwear thrown under the bed. Blood and brain tissue was on her pillow. She also had a blood spot on the inside of her left leg above the knee, and it's been speculated that the killer pulled her down the bed. Some think she may have been the only one who woke up because of the position she was in, while others think the killer pulled her down after he killed her. Her sister Ina was on the right side of the bed, facing left towards Lena, with her hips rotated so that her buttocks was hanging out of the bed towards the direction of the lamp that was sitting on the floor next to the bed. Because of this display, it's believed the killer placed them this way for his viewing pleasure. However, doctors concluded they were not sexually abused. All of the Moore children appeared to have slept through the killing and were killed by blunt force trauma to the head. The marshal went back outside to Ross Moore and said, "My God, Ross, there's somebody murdered in every bed." He went back into town to get the doctor, and while he was there, made the grave mistake of mentioning the murder to some townspeople. Word spread like wildfire. Operators threw on the all-call switch that existed in the early 1900s and sent out a message letting everyone know about it. Stores closed down. Neighbors and friends told everyone they could. And it didn't take long for the Moores' property to become a madhouse. At least 100 people invaded the home to gawk at the bodies, running and shouting from room to room, possibly disturbing evidence. The marshal tried to get the situation under control, but when he'd get people out one door, more would come pouring in through another. No one would listen, and the coroner didn't arrive until after the townspeople did. Luckily, the marshal and 2 doctors had gone in the house first and managed to complete an examination of the scene before people started barging in. 2 finished cigarettes had been found in the attic, leading investigators to believe that the killer hid out there until the Moore family got home and went to sleep.
out of thin air.
It's said that nobody woke up during the murders.
But then things got worse.
Some believe the
Much
killer
worse.
may have drugged their
She not
food,
only heard
but
things,
they would stay
she began to see
asleep
things.
while the killings took
Terrifying
place.
things.
Another theory is that the killer delivered a single blow to their heads that was powerful enough to kill on the first strike, and then went back to the parents' room a second time to bludgeon their faces. There are 2 main theories to the bacon found wrapped in a cloth. The first is that the killer meant to steal it when they left. The other theory was that the slab of bacon had been used by the killer as an artificial vagina, judging from the way they positioned the Stillinger sisters, and that the bacon was next to them. However, no fluids or hair had been found at the crime scene. At the start of the investigation, there were several suspects and people who gave confessions to being the killer, but all were eventually dismissed as suspect. There were axe murders happening in other states as well, along the trail of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Whether it was the same person or not, the axe murder sites were easy to reach if you were traveling by train. Many of the axe murders were done the same way, with whole families being killed and bludgeoned with the blunt end of the axe. Some houses even had the windows and mirrors covered, like in Villisca. It took 2 years for a trial to take place for the Villisca murders. It seemed like every person in town had someone to suspect. Everybody was scared, and the sense of peace Villisca had was gone. Days after the murder, you couldn't find a gun or door lock available because they had all been bought out. Despite the many people who had been suspected, prime suspects were Senator of Iowa Frank Jones, Reverend George Kelly, William Mansfield, Andy Sawyer, and Henry Lee Moore. Frank Jones was an employer of Josiah for several years until Josiah managed to open up his own implement company. It was after this that Frank and Josiah became competitive rivals. Their relationship became so bitter that they didn't talk to each other whenever they crossed paths in town. There was also a rumor, which had never been proven, that Josiah had an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law, which added contention to their already soured relationship. Frank became part of a theory that he had hired William Blackie Mansfield to kill the Moores. William Mansfield became a suspect of the Villisca murders 2 years after they happened, when he was suspected of killing his own wife, infant, and father and mother-in-law with an axe. He was also believed to have committed axe murders that took place in Paola, Gas. The one who blamed him for the murders was Detective James Newton Wilkerson from the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City, who had pieced together a story with the rumors of the town against Joan. Mansfield's family was found bludgeoned, axe wiped clean, mirrors and windows covered with clothes and lamps on the floor by the bed. However, Mansfield was acquitted of the charges when his payroll records proved he was in Illinois during the time of the Villisca murder. Mansfield later sued Detective Wilkerson and received $225 several months after the Villisca killing. A man named Henry Moore, who had no relationship to the Moore family, was convicted for the murder of his mother and grandmother in Columbia, MO, after killing them with an axe. A federal investigator believed he was responsible for the Villisca murders, as well as 22 other axe murders across the country. Another prime suspect in the Villisca murders was Reverend George Kelly. Reverend Kelly and his wife arrived in New York from England in 1904. He was a traveling preacher who preached across the U.S. at country churches. Kelly was well known as a sexual deviant who had mental problems. He was seen peeking through windows, and he had already been arrested for writing lewd letters to women who first wrote to him in response to a job offer. Reverend Kelly was a guest at the church the Moores went to on the night of the Children's Day program. The following morning, he had left by train around 5:19 a.m. When he heard about the murders, he became very interested in them, almost obsessed. In the following weeks, he started writing letters to authorities and family members asking about details of the murder. He even visited the crime scene and joined a team of investigators who just happened to be there at the same time. Some investigators thought it was strange how into the case he was, so a detective named Tom O'Leary wrote a letter back to him asking him for details on the murder. Reverend Kelly's reply seemed far-fetched. He claimed to have been walking past the Moore's house when he heard the thud of the axe. He claimed the killer was disturbed by a couple walking by and had stepped out onto the porch until they had passed. He also said Mrs. Moore had reared up in bed before the killer struck. The main thing brought up against Kelly in court was that he was supposedly talking about the murder on the train that morning before it was discovered. A lot of people, including some authorities, were unsure of the credibility of his words because he had obvious mental problems. Kelly was arrested in 1917 and was put in jail all summer when he was interrogated by 3 burly men, a state attorney, a sheriff, and James Risdon, head of what would later be Iowa Criminal Investigation. They were shouting at him and threatening him, trying to get him to confess. Kelly said that God told him to commit the murder, saying, "Suffer the children to come on to me."
He and his wife were driven out of this house in Villisca, Iowa by an axe murderer's ghost. The place stayed empty for quite some time. But then, in the 60s,
Our first night sleeping here, it was really weird.
Myself, my sister Patty, and Betty, we were all sleeping in the living room on pallets on the floor.
I was sound asleep, and my sister woke me up.
Woke up in the middle of the night hearing like a faint crying, like a whimpering sound. Being kids, I thought it was my sister trying to scare us in a new house.
And I said, "What? I'm not doing anything. I'm sleeping." She goes, "No, you're making those noises." And I said, "No, I'm not."
I told her to listen. She heard it. So then we thought it was Betty. It was not.
It sounded like a little girl's faint crying. And then the room was really cold.
And it was not wintertime. The room was just really cold.
When we got up the next morning, we explained it to our mother, and our mother just said it was our imagination running wild with us.